Hello, everyone. Welcome back to part 3 of our 4-part mini lecture series on the epidemiology of pandemics and specific lessons for COVID-19. Today, we're going to get into the meat of the lecture where we talk specifically about COVID-19 and some of the implications that the data are showing us. Because there's quite a bit of content I want to get through in 5 or so minutes, I'm going to jump right into it. But last, I want to remind you, I'm Kyle Fries. I'm the epidemiologist for FTC Health. So COVID-19 is the disease caused by the virus SARS-CoV-2. You'll see them both in the literature, but more typically in the media, it's been called COVID-19. As many know, it was first detected in Wuhan, China, back in December of 2019, although there's argument that it might have been before that, given the availability of the data. As I mentioned in part 1, I gave the example of a new virus jumping from an animal reservoir, and they actually thought that's how COVID-19 came about, likely jumped from bats into human host, then propagated from there. The symptoms that we know about include a cough that starts dry, a very spiking fever, shortness of breath, any tiredness above normal are the things that most people most commonly complain of. So this map is already outdated. It seems to be changing daily. I did include the link here that you can click on. Basically, this just goes to the Johns Hopkins dashboard that they're tracking the number of new cases by region as well as the number of deaths. So here, this is kind of sort of the beginning of the outbreak. This is, I think, the beginning or mid-March. And as of now, I think it's affecting over 150 countries. So obviously, this map is more blue than it was at the time of this creation. So I encourage you to take a look at this link. And the WHO also has a really great dashboard if you're interested in tracking this in real time. Also, to go back to part 2 of this little lecture series, I talked about how the 1918 Spanish flu spread around the world in about 4 months, but that was just primarily through shipping and trade routes, migration routes, basic forms of transportation back then. We don't live in that world anymore. Today, you can get from one end of the planet to the other in about a day, which is also an illustration of how COVID-19 happened to spread around so quickly and why it's so hard to contain in today's modern world of transportation. This is also a little outdated back on the March 10th. Obviously, things are changing daily. But I just wanted to point out that this is a typical epidemic curve, but it is broken up into 3 different compartments, one being the current cases in the yellow on the bottom, and then the deaths being in the middle, and then the number of recovered at the top in green. So a couple things you would expect over time that the number of recovered would actually increase, or percent would increase. We would hope for that, but this also illustrates the general shape of an epidemic curve. You see that initial spike about midway through the graph, and then after a little recession, and then as you can see, it's starting to trend back upward, which we'd expect for a typical propagating source epidemic, kind of entering the second worldwide epidemic wave. In the next slide, I show exactly what we're facing now. I just updated this before this recording because before it was outdated as of 5 days ago. And it's pretty clear here that we have the very pronounced upward swing in this second epidemic curve looking at worldwide data. As you can see, moving left to right on the graph, there's the initial spike that we saw in China. There's a gap missing it in the graph intentionally there because that's when we saw that artificial spike overnight from when Chinese officials changed the definition of what constituted a case. So I excluded those just to keep my scale in line. And then after you saw that, there's a little bit of a dip, and then of course it went back up pretty precipitously, and again, it just continues to rise every day. The next slide, I'll show what's kind of driving this relationship. So this is outdated. I wanted to point out the date on the bottom of here is March 11th, but I intentionally left this in because I wanted to compare this with the next slide, and you can see how much things change and how quickly they change. So I kept the scale on the bottom the same. This is looking between January 21st and March 11th, looking at the same 3 countries and then worldwide. So worldwide is the top line, and then downwards to Italy, China, and the United States is right there on the bottom. So this is showing the number of new cases per day on the linear scale. And on here, at this point, it looked like Italy was driving the worldwide rise in number of cases per day, with China kind of deteriorating there and the US still barely noted here on this graph. I did just update this right before this recording, and it is the 23rd of March today. So this is what it looks like now. Same time scale, the 21st of January through the 23rd of March, looking at the world, the US, Italy, and China, things have changed quite a bit. Again, this is the number of new confirmed cases per day by the country. So look at the general pattern. I'm going to pop back here for a second just so you can refresh your memory on what the actual y-axis is showing. So this was just a couple weeks ago. The scale only goes up to 275 new cases per day. We're at over 30,000 now. This is exponential growth. I do have one more slide for this part of the lecture, and then in the fourth part, we're going to dig into different case fatalities by subgroup and patient characteristics, things of that nature. But I wanted to end with this part of the lecture by comparing the different pandemics that I've talked about the course of the first three parts of this lecture series, and comparing the cases, the deaths, and then the overall case fatality rate. So just to orient you a little bit, across the top in the four columns are COVID-19 starting with, and then moving left to right is the swine flu of 2009, followed by 2002 SARS, and then finally the 1918 Spanish flu, since that was kind of a worst case scenario. So we'll start with that one. As I mentioned, the number of cases was around 500 million, and there were at least 50 million deaths worldwide from this 1918 Spanish flu. I put the overall case fatality rate as at least 2.5% because that's what's cited in the literature. Obviously, 50 million divided by 500 million is 10%. So obviously 2.5% case fatality rate is a conservative estimate. And then moving left, harking back to what I said in previous lectures, that the crude number of deaths wasn't super high for SARS, but the way it manifested itself, how fast it killed, and the type of people that it killed were causes for concern. And by the end of the outbreak, the case fatality was almost 11%, which is obviously pretty significant. H1N1, the next column to the left, infected about 60 million people worldwide. The official death toll is about 18,500, but a lot of experts believe that it's likely closer to 200,000 because of all the residual effects and deaths that could probably be directly attributed to the H1N1 virus of 2009. Still, the overall case fatality rate was under 1%. Do want to remind you, and I'll talk about this in the next lecture, that seasonal influenza typically has a case fatality rate of about 0.1%. So H1N1 was essentially 10 times as deadly as seasonal flu. And then lastly, this column, again, I just updated right before this lecture. As of evening time, Arizona, and on the 23rd of March, there were over 300,000 cases. The Johns Hopkins dashboard is actually citing a little bit more, at least 15,000 deaths worldwide so far. And then the overall case fatality rate is highly dependent on which subgroup you look in. So that's why the question mark is there. That's not a typo or a formatting issue. So it's at least, they think 1%, but then I know in some subgroups they're calling for upwards of 15% case fatality rate, and especially in some of the older populations. So I think that's a good place to end. In the next lecture, we're going to talk about the specific people who are being affected, what their case fatality rates are, what are the likely drivers of that. So I hope you come back for the final part in our series. Thank you for listening.